Why on earth does World Wildlife Fund work on cities and climate change? Just to explain what I'm doing here. We are definitely an organization that's best known for working on charismatic megafauna. And in the 1980s, we realized that some of the species that we worked on were really facing an incredible threat. And so we realized that these species that had co-evolved with climate over millions of years were actually facing an environment that they couldn't live in anymore. It no longer would make sense for a polar bear to be white in 30 years, we saw. And so around in the 1980s, we started working on climate change. And we thought to ourselves back at the time, what do we do about this issue? What can we bring to the table? What do we really have to offer? And we looked around and we said, well, we have a brand, we have members, we have about 1.2 million members in the US. We have connections, we have a lot of corporate connections, we have a lot of high-level connections around the world, and we have this huge international presence and can bring experiences from around the world and share them. And we operate in about 100 countries, and what brought us into the work I'm going to talk about today, which is kind of an experiment for us in the US, reaching out and working on cities, was really this question that I get pretty much every day from my colleagues around the world, which is, what exactly is wrong with Americans? Why don't you get it? Why don't you get climate change? What's the deal? And I think actually this morning we heard a lot of interesting answers to that question. We heard a lot about maybe it's not quite so bad, and maybe we get it a little bit more than we used to get it. But from an international perspective, it's still hard for me to go to my colleagues in WF Fiji or WF Nepal or WF South Africa, where they just introduced a carbon tax, and explain why we haven't moved here in the United States. And so we started just interviewing people and asking them, what's wrong with America? What do we do about what's going on here? And one of the answers that was very important for us was from Keya and others, these emotions that were behind this inaction, these emotions of helplessness in the face of climate change, of fear. People were really scared, and then people also felt guilty. They knew that they were in some way complicit in this, and why on earth would you want to think or talk about something that makes you feel those emotions? So you just shut it out of your brain and you go on with your daily life, which is hard enough as it is. We also found evidence, again, from some of the great work of many people here, that talking about preparedness and adaptation could actually be a way to get more public support for thinking and talking about climate change. And we did a lot of our own focus groups and found that even people who were really climate doubters told us that they wanted their cities to be prepared. They did not, they did not think climate change was happening. They did not think it was caused by human beings, but they did want their city to prepare for climate change, nonetheless. They didn't want to live in a place that wasn't taking it seriously. And so, sorry, I think there we go. And so what we discovered is that so many people are interested in resilience and preparing for climate change because they're taking this journey of caring about climate change from a very different direction from the way that I took it, or probably from the way that many of us here took it. And I can say for myself, I came into this community really wanting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I wanted to cut carbon pollution. It took me a while to come to the point where I really wanted to work on preparedness and adaptation. Most Americans are taking this journey the exact opposite direction. They're coming into this from experiencing impacts, wanting to do something to prepare, and that is making them concerned about mitigation. And they see that cities are on the front lines of dealing with these issues, and they themselves feel that they are on the front lines of dealing with climate change, and they want to be living in cities that are taking them seriously. There's a lot of skepticism we found in our focus groups about Congress in particular. There was a lot less skepticism about local government, and people look to local government to be taking actions. And so, taking all of this into account, we were trying to figure out how could we develop a model to recognize the cities that are taking action. And again, it's an experiment in many senses. We rolled it out in 6 countries this past year. We built it off of an event that we already had, to use an engagement ladder approach and try to take, it's also sort of a foot in the door approach. So we had some ability to talk to communities through an event we already had, and it was called Earth Hour. And so it's an event where we ask people, cities, individuals, iconic landmarks, to turn off their lights for 1 hour to show their support for action on climate change. And pretty much any icon you can imagine participates. So if you can imagine in your mind's eye, the Bird's Nest Stadium in China, the Eiffel Tower, Big Ben, the pyramids in Egypt, the Las Vegas Strip here in the US, the Empire State Building, all of these icons were participating already. All of these cities were participating already. And so we wanted to take that engagement that we already had and see if we could take it another step. And so we launched something called the Earth Hour City Challenge in the US, Canada, Sweden, Norway, Italy, and India. We piloted it in Sweden the first year. We did it in 6 years the following year. And the model is really to get individuals, starting with WWF members, to contact city leaders and compel action. And so we have what we think is probably a pretty first-in-the-kind kind of application on our website. So if you go to earthhourcitychallenge.org, you'll find this map of the United States. And we actually have the email addresses of every mayor and city council member in America. So if you go to this map and click on any state, you will find the local impacts of climate change in that state where you live, and it generates a letter to the mayor and to all the elected officials after you type in your zip code, asking them to prepare for the impacts of climate change, join the Earth Hour City Challenge, and invest in renewable energy. And just to give you an example of how we get the message out, so for example, after Superstorm Sandy hit, we have 600,000 Facebook followers, 200,000 plus Twitter followers. We sent a note to them and we said, is your city prepared for climate change? Urge your mayor to prepare. And that kind of really local action, it makes climate change about here and now and not about polar bears and Arctic foxes, which is what we were really trying to do. And we got a huge response to that. And in fact, we've gotten much, much more response in general than we anticipated. And our goals were really threefold in engaging people. One, we thought engaging people, we felt possibly, and this is kind of a hypothesis, could really change their identity. So once you get them to take one action that's really about their community, you then turn them into an activist. They're the kind of person who just sent an email about climate change. And then you can get them to take behaviors after that. You can get them to do additional actions. And we actually have found that once these people take this action, it is much easier to get them to take additional actions after that. The second reason we wanted to do this was to support people, a lot of the people like you in this room, people who were in the cities doing the sustainability work, to make sure we were getting messages to elected officials supporting that work, so that we know that a lot of anti-environmental messages get to elected officials. We don't know that a lot of pro-environmental messages get out there. And so part of what we wanted to do is make sure that elected officials who wanted to get elected again would know that there's support out there in the community. And then finally, we thought there might be pockets of cities where we actually would inspire additional action, where maybe they didn't even have a sustainability director, and the elected official would get this email and it would inspire interest in doing something that they might not otherwise do. And again, we got way more response from this map than we anticipated. Our goal in the first year was to have 100 cities contacted in the US, and we ended up with well over 2,000 cities contacted. And part of this was just, I think, that it was such a dramatic year, not just in terms of Sandy, but the drought in the middle of the country, the wildfires. It was really quite an incredible year in terms of impacts. Our goal in the first year was also to have 7 cities join, and we ended up having 29 communities join. So we felt like we had some interest, but this is just kind of the first step for us. We want to create a platform to allow cities to share their stories, and we really want to share the stories of cities with our membership, because we want to tackle this sense of helplessness. And hearing about what cities are doing helps people feel a little bit more empowered, that at least somebody's doing something about this. And it's a lot easier at the city level. And so some of the things that we're trying to provide to the communities that are working at are plugging them into other initiatives. Some of you probably saw the White House just announce this Resilient Communities initiative. So making sure that we have communities we're working with plugged into every other opportunity that we know of. Highlighting city leadership, helping cities deal with opposition. We've talked a couple times today about the Agenda 21ers who believe that the UN is a I don't even know what they believe the UN is, but they believe it's bad and that sustainability is a plot to take over their land ownership rights. And I think that's kind of the best thing that they think about the UN. And those people are really good at turning out. They're really good at getting city level action. They're really good at translating those wins into empowering them to take on state level action. And so we're trying to follow that model and make sure we're turning out our members when, when somebody needs to site a transmission line for renewable energy, when somebody's having a city planning meeting. Of course, we want to get media attention for cities, and to the extent that we can, with our limited abilities, we wanted to provide financial support to cities, because we definitely heard very, very clearly as we entered this experiment that the main obstacle that cities are facing is financial. And so we provided this year three $30,000 grants to cities. The other thing that we've ended up doing that we didn't necessarily anticipate was using the stories of cities in the congressional context. I live in Washington, D.C. I spend a lot of my time, or a fair amount of my time on the Hill, and I think it's worth getting you an understanding of the kinds of things that we face and are fighting back on a daily basis. So this is the text of an actual amendment, and just to give you some sense of the kinds of things that we spend our lives trying to fight back. This is an amendment that would prevent the Department of Homeland Security that runs FEMA and the Coast Guard from talking about adaptation. And when we have these stories of cities, and when we can go into an office and say, hey, we're here because this, this city in your state is a member of this city challenge, they kind of welcome us in, and then we can say, but look, the things the city is trying to do are going to be a lot harder if you make it illegal for federal agencies to talk about climate change or adaptation. And it gives us an in. Another story is, Beaverton, Oregon is one of the communities that we work with, and their congressional representative is on the House Science Committee. And because we're very engaged in what's going on in Congress, we know when the Science Committee hearings are, as I like to call them these days, the anti-science hearings. And so 2 days before the last quote-unquote Science Committee hearing on climate change, we were able to get that congressional representative a long list of everything that was happening in Beaverton so that they could use that in their opening statements. And really, timeliness is incredibly important in DC. So if you can inject the stories from cities to the right people at the right time, then it can really make a difference in terms of what's happening congressionally, or at least start the conversation happening in the right way in DC. And getting people talking about preparedness is a really effective way of getting people to have a constructive conversation that we found. And of course, none of you will be surprised to hear that we found much, much more leadership in the United States than certainly our international colleagues expected when we looked at the city level. Some of the things that we found were really impressive to us, particularly around renewable energy. There are 6 states out there where communities can use community aggregated purchasing and invest in 100% renewable energy. And that was incredibly impressive to a lot of our colleagues around the world. And eventually we want to start to share these stories internationally as well, so that we can get best practices as well as share them elsewhere. And of course, we want to encourage citizens to continue to engage at the city level. This has been really, really effective in the Tea Party context, and we think we can be really effective with this on our side too. Because if they engage at the city level and they send the city emails and see the city actually doing something, it can be very empowering. And if we can get them beyond that sense of helplessness, then we can take them along the engagement ladder and really turn our own members and other individuals out there into activists who are taking individual behavior changes seriously, but also taking civic action really seriously. And my ultimate goal is perhaps very ambitious, but I really think we can get it in the next few years, where nobody will ever ask me again what is wrong with America, and instead they will look at us and they'll look at all the amazing things that all the cities are doing, and they'll say, how do we do that? So thank you very much.